not only is the world failing to allocate enough quantity of capital to the green transition in general, but it is also not using the right quality of finance.
Hello, this is the weekly Tradecast podcast brought to you by UN Trade and Development. I'm Sarah Toms. We're exploring how major events are shaping trade and development and how that affects billions of people around the world. As the COP29 Global Climate Summit gets underway, we're talking about the money we need for the green transition and how we can get this vital funding. It will take trillions of dollars to meet climate and development goals. The world's advanced economies have pledged billions of dollars to help developing countries move to cleaner energy and protect themselves from climate change. So far, few of the promises have been met, and just a small amount of that funding is flowing. Attracting enough climate-related investment is also a challenge, especially for developing countries. At COP29 in Azerbaijan and well into the future, one big question remains: how can we finance the green transition and really make a difference? To follow the money and explore the links between investment, development, and the environment, I'm joined now by Sony Kapoor, Professor of Climate, Geoeconomics and Finance at the European University Institute. The views in this episode are those of the guest. Sony, what would you say the funding situation is now for the green transition, and how and where are the financing and investment happening?
Well, take your pick of the adjective: disastrous, perilous, absolute, totally shocking. Uh, you can pick any extreme negative adjective, and that probably is the most accurate summary as to how little of the financing compared to what is necessary has materialized. And it is both about quantity and quality. On quantity, one general feature of a green economy is that you are essentially trying to substitute long-term operational costs of the kinds that you need, for example, in coal or gas or oil power generation, versus a much higher upfront capital cost. So only recently and in certain countries has the overall lifetime cost of solar energy generation, for example, fallen below the levels of comparable electricity generation from coal and gas. The green development pathway has an upfront capital requirement that is roughly 2 to 3 times compared to a development pathway that is far more polluting and not environmentally sustainable, right? So the fact that we have agreed, at least in principle, to go down a path of sustainable development and the green transition means that we will need to put much more upfront capital, even if the lifetime cost of that investment is more profitable than the alternative. The world wants developing and emerging economies to embark on a development trajectory that is sustainable, which requires much more of the one thing that they do not have, which is capital. And as long as the OECD, the EU, the rich world is not willing, either through public finance or through reallocation of institutional investment, to help fund that additional upfront capital costs, the sustainable transition, the green transition simply is not going to happen.
What is the right mix of development financing, borrowing, and private sector investment to really tackle climate change?
That brings us to the quality issue. Right now, I'm feeling generous today. So I'm going to make a proposition. I offer you $1 billion in grant. You can go away with, right? No questions asked. Or I offer you $10 billion of equity investment, or I give you $100 billion of, highly rated debt, but that comes with very strict binding constraints on what you can do with that money, right? Now, the fact that you will need to think about which of these is the thing you should agree to take from me highlights the central issue of the importance of the quality of capital, right? So there are certain things for which grant money alone will suffice, in particular, adaptation to existing climate change that is already locked in, for example. There are things where risk bearing capacity is required, risky projects that may have long gestation periods, uncertain technology, uncertain payoffs, etc. And then there are things that can be done with debt. So not only is the world failing to allocate enough quantity of capital to the renewable energy generation, grid transformation, and green transition in general, but it is also not using the right quality of finance. So far too much of the money, of whatever little is available only in the form of loans, which often are an inadequate instrument to fund the kinds of investments that are needed. So we need much more of debt, yes, but we need a far greater proportion of risk bearing equity investments, guarantees, and definitely much, much more of overseas development aid and grants.
Well, as you said, funding is the big question, but in a world of conflicts and crises, how can developing countries hope to get this green support that they need?
Let's take a step back and assume that the rich world and its funding giants, both public and private sector, including the large institutional investors, pension funds, etc., don't care about either the SDGs or climate or development, right? So the question is there a case to be made to reallocate existing portfolios, somewhere between 85 to 100% of which are invested in other rich OECD economies or the EU, towards developing and emerging countries, right? And the answer is absolutely yes. The developing world in general is much faster, and favorable demographics and productivity growth are the two major drivers of growth. So there's a very clear return-based driver. There is also a risk-based driver. So finance 101 is, do not put all your eggs in one basket. And yet, the vast majority of our investments are in rich economies, all of which are facing demographic decline and low productivity growth, and have high levels of economic and financial and trade interlinkages. Whereas the economic and financial interlinkages and the similarity in structural terms between emerging economies is much, much lower. What does the Brazilian economy have in common with the Indonesian one, right? So there's a much greater level of structural diversification that genuinely, contrary to the narrative, which is, developing economies are risky. At an individual basis, perhaps they are, but on a portfolio basis, reallocating large sums of money towards emerging and developing economies will actually reduce the portfolio risk of Western institutional investors. So both on a risk and a return basis, there is a very substantial case to be made for large-scale reallocation. In addition to that, the fact of the matter is that it is only developing and emerging economies that are systemic to whether the climate and the nature crisis will be addressed. Whether biodiversity loss will be stemmed or not is dependent on actions taken or not taken by everyone from Brazil to Nigeria to India to Bangladesh and many other countries in the global south, much more than what, for example, Sweden can do by making sure the next installation of steel is green. This is a marriage made in heaven, where both out of narrow self-interest to boost our domestic growth in the rich world, to make sure our pension system is viable, and to be able to address climate change and biodiversity loss, In the near term, the answers all lie in the same direction, which is large scale reallocation of our public and private money towards developing and emerging economies.
What are the incentives and opportunities that you were talking about for investors and finance providers in this greener, more sustainable economy?
So I advise a number of institutional investors, and when we get asked to evaluate an investment opportunity, there is this idea that each project is evaluated on its own merit, right? And that is actually not true. The question is, what will this do to my portfolio? From this perspective, what is extremely attractive to reduce the risk of my portfolio, to boost returns, and to be able to capitalize on what inevitably will be a much larger share of the future economy, which is green renewable technologies. The thing that makes most sense is to allocate large sums of money towards the latest, most cutting edge green technologies being developed in venture capital, to large scale rollout of existing technologies such as solar power, to rolling out the latest technologies we're developing on green cement and green steel, etc., in developing emerging economies. The biggest profitable opportunities, even in the most cynical, conflict ridden world, lie in emerging economies where demand for these technologies and their deployment will be very high, where growth rates are much higher. So there is a clear pathway that is feasible, financeable, that both allows these countries to escape the low investment, bad equilibrium, poverty trap they're stuck in, and is able to eventually make the financing of the green transition in these economies purely commercial, even if for the next 10 years, 20 years or so, they would require a stronger, higher grant element.
Of course, COP29, who needs to do what to break the impasse that we have right now? And what outcome would you like to see now and going on afterwards?
I'm afraid there is no COP outcome that is going to be successful, or that is going to be ambitious enough to meet the scale of the challenge. However, I think recognizing that the future of climate change and the degree of global warming we end up with will be decided in the global south primarily by decisions they take or not take, recognizing that what the rich world is asking countries as varied as Brazil or Ecuador or Nigeria or India to do requires much more of upfront capital. I think that recognition that there is a grand bargain to be made that benefits everybody, boosts our growth in rich economies, boosts our pension fund returns, allows our companies to be profitable while allowing countries to deliver on the development needs that must come first for their citizens, while taking a different, new, as yet uncharted path for a development model that is actually compatible with increasingly binding environmental constraints.
Is this possible, though, Sonny?
The optimistic answer is yes, just about yes. And that is this new grand bargain between the global south and rich economies that requires financing, but on mostly profitable terms, that requires technology transfer without having to give up your intellectual property, but will in turn deliver a massive boost to global growth that is potentially twice as large as what we saw with the last golden age of globalization, because there's something in there for everybody.
Thank you to Sony Kapoor, Professor of Climate, Geopolitics and Finance at the European University Institute, who was this week's guest. Tune into the Weekly Tradecast next week and every week for more insights on the most pressing issues around the world of trade and development. And there's even more on our website, unctad.org. I'm Sarah Thomas in Geneva. Goodbye for now.